Hello and welcome to FPL Mate, your best mate for fantasy Premier League content for the 2023-24 season. My name is Dan and I know a lot of you guys have probably seen tips of FPL in the past, but there are some secret expert tips that are not spoken about nearly enough, maybe because they're too complicated or they're just too high level. So if you guys are ready to take your FPL game to the next level, these 3 tips are really going to help you out. And if you do enjoy this one, do drop a like and do subscribe if you want more FPL content on your screens. Let's get started. Now, we all know that using stats and data is a great way to take your FPL to the next level. But if you want to level up one more, using those stats in a very, very good way with context and using them effectively is the way to do it. You know, you can't just look at plain old numbers. If a player takes a lot of shots, if a player gets a lot of XG, that doesn't actually tell you everything. So there are some ways of using that data a little bit more effectively. So, for example, how big is the data sample size? Data observed over a longer period of time is usually a bit more trustworthy. If you see a player's doing well over the last few game weeks, that's fine. But if they've also consistently shown that over months or maybe even years, that's probably going to give you a better idea of if that data is going to be consistent going forward. You want to look at who the opponents are as well. If a player registers a lot of shots on target or a lot of expected goals against weaker opponents in the last 5 games, for example, is that as useful as seeing a more spread, a more even kind of difficulty of fixtures in there? There could be a little bit of difference in there. Think about the performance of the goalkeepers as well. I remember last season we saw Solly March get a lot of XG and it kind of looked like, oh, maybe Solly March is just a bad finisher. But there was a couple of games, I remember one against Brentford in particular, where he had some really good chances, but David Raya for Brentford was just making some insane saves and actually keeping him out of the net. So it wasn't that March was being a poor finisher in that instance, but the keeper was just so good right there. And also, is there any luck involved? And that is definitely a factor. A really simple example of this is kind of using penalties. So when I look at data from players, I often look at non-penalty expected goals, for example, rather than just plain old expected goals, because you can't always tell when a penalty is going to happen. So I feel like it does need to be treated almost separately in that kind of way. Penalty takers are still very, very important, but you do have to know that you require a little bit of luck to get that penalty on the game week where you are picking that player or captaining that player. There's other ways of players getting lucky in goals, you know, fluke incidents, things like, you know, a goalkeeper just passes it out to the striker on the opposite team just by accident. Doesn't happen very often, so it's, you know, you probably should not consider that as part of a useful data set too often. So I do think that's important, but I do want to go through something that is a really, really good tip that you guys can take forward about expected goal data in particular. So Erling Haaland is a good finisher, a very good finisher in fact, and you can see over his last 4 seasons he's consistently outperformed his expected goal data. So that means that when Erling Haaland has, you know, 1 XG in a game, you can probably expect him to score it, maybe even score 2 goals from a 1 XG during a game. Whereas if you kind of pick a player who is not such a good finisher, then maybe with 1 XG, they may not even score 1 goal. And here's an example of that. Gabriel Jesus, so his stats per 90 minutes suggest that even though he does generate a decent amount of XG, he doesn't make as good of that data. So he's not going to score as many goals as a better finisher would in the same kind of situation. So yes, XG data is very, very, very useful, but you have to take it in with context as well. If a player is getting a lot of XG, but they're not a great finisher, then the better finisher, who maybe has slightly lower XG, might actually be the better pick. Here are just some more random examples for you. These are kind of popular players in FPL a lot of us are talking about right now. Kane, Wilson, Martinelli. These players are very decent finishers, so they are going to be making good on their chances. Players like Salah and Rashford usually come out about even with their XG data, so they score when they're expected to score in that kind of situations. Watkins can be a bit up and down. He is capable of missing chances, and you've got players like Mbumo and Gabriel Mitoma there as well, who are, unfortunately, they have okay XG data, but they're not actually going to score from as many chances. They're not great finishers. They're not very clinical players, so they're naturally not going to make as good of that data. So when you're looking at players and kind of ordering it by, okay, who is getting the most XG, you have to kind of weight it a little bit towards who is the better finisher, who is the poorer finisher, who is going to make the best of their XG, if that makes sense. So yes, we have players like Salah and Martinelli. Obviously, Salah generates a lot more XG, but Martinelli may actually score a similar amount of goals whilst they're on the pitch, per 90 minutes. I know Salah is obviously going to get more minutes than Martinelli, but they actually may score a similar amount of goals just based on the fact that Martinelli may finish a few more chances than Salah over the course of the season, which are not saying Salah is a bad finisher, but just players like Martinelli, Wilson, Kane. These guys are really good finishers, so they are going to score them goals. System changes. This is a huge part of FPL, and this is your tip number 2. So I want to talk about this a little bit because sometimes it's difficult to notice when a system has changed or really take a lot of precedence on that. So kind of think about teams that did poorly last season. Does that mean they're going to do poorly this season? We've got Chelsea, for example. Last year, they did very, very poorly. I think we'll all admit that, even Chelsea fans. But just because Chelsea did bad last season doesn't mean you have to think they're going to do bad this season. They've got a new manager, everything's looking very, very good. So Pochettino's Chelsea, it's not going to be the same as Potter's or Lampard's Chelsea, so that doesn't mean we should be writing off a Ben Chilwell or a Reece James just because they had bad seasons last year. Very tempted to ignore them this year, but actually things could very, very quickly change. Does a player have a new role in their team? Do they have a new position? Do they have new responsibilities, for example? And we are going to speak about that in a little bit more detail shortly, but in general, we are going to see players not always playing the same position now as they may have done previously. So we can, for example, look at the data from last year. If they're playing in a very different way to last year, then they're not going to have the same sort of stats. They're not going to generate as many FPL points. And we also have to look at new signings impacting current players. And I think when new signings come into clubs, a lot of the focus and attention is drawn to the new player, but not as much to the players around them. So, for example, I think Bruno Fernandes is a really good example. He played last season a lot of the time with Weghorst, who was playing up front. And when Weghorst was playing up front and Fernandes is the creator, it's kind of difficult to generate all of this expected assists, but there's no one really to finish it off at the end. So he can make as many key passes, create as many big chances, but if he doesn't have a kind of a top goal scorer in front of him, then he's not actually going to be able to get as many FPL points. So Fernandes, with the new striker signing in Højlund for Manchester United, is hopefully going to elevate Fernandes to a new level. He's now got a proper striker to pass to. Equally, new signing like Højlund is maybe going to impact Rashford a little bit, because Rashford won't have to be the main goal scorer in the team anymore. Not to say that Rashford is not going to score goals, but obviously the dependency on Rashford is not going to be quite as high as it was last year. So I think the best example of a system change is Liverpool. Kind of the last maybe 8 games of last season, they did change their system. We've seen the seam new system in pre-season as well. So we're expecting them to go forward with it kind of going forward into this new season. But just at the start of last season, this is kind of their old system, maybe from years gone by as well. What we would see is, these wing backs, these full backs pushing up very, very high up the pitch. We had the 2 wingers scoring a lot of the goals, maybe the central striker actually a little bit deeper, kind of a false 9 kind of situation there, and that was great for many players. It was great for Robertson, it was great for Trent. Salah doing really well there as well. Darwin could be on the left, he could be in the centre maybe, but I want to focus on these 4 players in particular because their positions in this system is not the same as the one for the new system. So we do have to kind of treat the players, whatever they achieved last season, we have to treat it a little bit differently and think about it a little bit differently. So this is the Liverpool system now, pretty much. I know it's not going to be 100% accurate, but I know it's probably much more complicated than this, but just to try and simplify it just a little bit, what we see is that the left back tucks in, kind of becomes more of a centre back. So Robertson is basically being killed as an FPL asset. I know a lot of people will look at Robertson in the past and think, he's done really well in the past, can he do it again? Well, the answer is probably not, because he's playing in a very different position. We see Trent tucking in, playing as an inverted right back, which could be good for him, it could be bad for him. I think the jury's still out for that, but I imagine Trent will probably perform similarly as he did last year, but hopefully with a few more clean sheets. But what's quite interesting here is Salah is pushed out just a little bit wider, which increases his assist potential, but does damage his goal scoring potential just a little bit. So still a very, very good pick, but because he's not going to be getting quite as many goals as he was previously, maybe that does diminish his kind of appeal as a captain option, because obviously with our midfielders, we get the big points from goals, right? So that's kind of what we want. We want goal scoring midfielders, and maybe Salah still going to get a lot of points, but is he going to get as many goals? Is he going to get as many big scores. He might be a bit more consistent because he's going to be creating more and getting assists, but if he just gets a few less goals, then maybe his captain potential is just diminished just that little bit. Darwin Núñez, on the other hand, coming in as a central striker now, more of a traditional number 9, which hopefully should be a good thing for him as well. So Darwin, actually genuinely a player to watch, despite the fact he was quite a trolly player last year. He could do really well this season if he is going to be playing in that number 9 position rather than off on the wing or playing a little bit deeper or things like that. Now he is in the middle, probably going to be the target man for a lot of what Liverpool are doing. Spurs is a little bit of a different situation, but there is still a system change that does need to be appreciated. So last season, under Conte and under previous managers as well, to be fair, Spurs were quite a negative and defensive team. Didn't really score too many goals. Tried not to concede too many goals either. I've just put some kind of a rough example of how they laid out on the screen, but what we saw was a lot of defensive players, not too many attacking players, and therefore the scorelines were often pretty low. Not too many goals, but hopefully not too many goals conceded either. The wing backs could maybe be picked and depended on a little bit more. You might consider going for a defender if you're going to get a clean sheet there, and not too many attackers to pick from either. Now, we've seen in pre-season under Postecoglou that Spurs now are very, very attacking, very, very open, which is going to be very interesting and exciting to watch, let me tell you that for sure, but it is going to impact on which kind of FPL assets we want to pick from Spurs. So the defenders, they're not going to be quite as appealing because we're expecting Spurs to concede more goals, but we're also expecting them to score more goals, generate more chances, and just become chance generation machines. And we're going to get a few more goals, we're going to get a few more assists from those more attacking players. So there are positives and negatives to the new Spurs system. The positives are, I think we can actually maybe go in on some of those forwards. The negatives, the defenders may be off the cards, at least at the start of the season, until they maybe kind of figure out where they are exactly. And my third tip that nobody is talking about is talisman theory. You guys may have heard me mention this briefly before, but I've never really spoken about it properly, never really got into detail. So talisman theory is basically the idea of picking FPL players who are the main guys in their team. So let's just go through these bullet points. So focus on the players and not the teams. I know it's very easy to say, you know, and I get this comment a lot on my videos. If I post my team, people might say, oh, Dan, I can't believe you've got no Liverpool players. Well, I would kind of reverse that and say, well, is that really a relevant question? I mean, if I put in, I don't know, if I put in Van Dijk, would that cover me for Liverpool players? If I put in, you know, Szoboszlai, would that cover me for Liverpool players? Possibly not. What we really want is a good player from Liverpool. We want a Salah. And if I was to go for a Luis Diaz, for example, does that mean I've now covered Liverpool? Probably not, because Salah, we know, is the talisman of that team. So that is the kind of thing we want. We want the talisman player rather than the just picking random players from a good team. And I know that makes a lot of intuitive sense. We speak about all that all the time, but I know people can be very tempted to just try and cover teams. You know, does Phil Foden cover Erling Haaland? Probably not quite, you know. So pick those talismanic players who are heavily involved in everything that their team does. These are the players that gobble up the FPL points from their teams. And you know, what we often see is, you know, even if a team is low scoring, I want to use the example of like Crystal Palace. So Crystal Palace, low scoring team, they may only score 1 or 2 goals per game, but you know that Eberechi Eze is probably going to be involved in those goals. So even though Crystal Palace, they're kind of a mid-table team, probably not too much interest in picking players from Crystal Palace, but if you can identify one player who is getting involved in a lot of what that team is doing, then actually they're a pretty great pick, really. Whereas, for example, and we can move on to the bonus point here that I've put down. You know, if we've got Arsenal winning 4-0 and Martinelli scores one of the goals, and we've got Crystal Palace win 1-0 and Eze scored the only goal in that game, just because they both scored 1 goal, one of them is going to get the bonus points, the other one possibly isn't. And the person who's getting the bonus points is Eze, because he is the one player doing the business in his team. Martinelli is perhaps competing with Saka, who's also got a goal. Jesus has also got a goal. Ødegaard's also got a goal in that game. And all of these players are competing for the same amount of bonus points. There's only 3 bonus points available to the top player. There's only 6 bonus points available total in an entire game. So, yeah, if you can go for a talisman, they're going to be the guy getting the bonus points. I want to throw this graphic on screen. I think this is super useful. So this is a screenshot from the Fantasy Football Hub Opta Stats tool, which I talk about a lot because I honestly, this is just my gospel. This is everything for FPL, and I think if you are a really serious FPL manager, you do want to be having that Opta-Stats tool at your disposal where you can have this control over stats, having a look at them, comparing different players like that. So I've left a link in the description for you guys to go check that out if you want to. But what I've got here is we've got this table of players kind of ordered by their goal involvement percentage. So what percentage of their team's goals does this player score? So Harry Kane last season was involved in 56% of his team's goals. So even though Spurs weren't really scoring too many goals last season, because Harry Kane was scoring or assisting potentially so many of them, he was getting all of the bonus points. He was getting loads of points. So it doesn't matter if Spurs don't score many goals. We've got Harry Kane. He scores them all anyway, so, that's great. Tony, the same thing. Brentford don't score a lot of goals, but last season we did see that because he was able to hog the few goals that they did have, it doesn't matter that we're picking from a mid-table team. It's still very, very good indeed. And I've highlighted some players here as well because I feel like there's some kind of interesting players that maybe our brains don't go to automatically because we're thinking, well, are we convinced by that team? Maybe, if we look at Morgan Gibbs-White, for example, for Nottingham Forest, like, I understand people don't want to pick a player from Nottingham Forest, but if Gibbs-White is involved in 45% of Forest's goals, it doesn't matter if Forest only score 1 or 2 goals per week. If Gibbs-White is on the pitch, which he will be, he's still going to be getting a decent amount of FPL points. We've got players like Eze, Bowen and Bumo slightly lower down the table there. And these are all the kind of on this list. These are kind of the most talismanic players in the Premier League at the moment from last season. Now, you will notice that there is not a lot of Arsenal players on here because Arsenal have a big spread of all kinds of different players getting the goals. Martinelli will score one, Saka will score one, like I was kind of talking about earlier. There's no Brighton players on this list either because Brighton, again, their attacking returns are very spread out. So in Game Week 1, for example, I know a lot of people are looking at Brighton and saying, hey, Brighton are playing against Luton Town. They could score 3 or 4 goals in this game, which is absolutely amazing. But it's very, very difficult to nail down which of their players is going to be getting the returns. You could say, I like Mitoma. I think he's going to get the goal. Well, yeah, that's fine. But looking at the data, there's just as much chance of Mitoma getting involved in the goals as a Solly March or maybe one of the forwards there as well. Maybe one of the wing backs, a Stupinian, for example. So you can pick the players, you can make a good guess, but it's difficult to nail it down. And I think that impacts captaincy in particular. Very difficult to pick a Arsenal captain, for example, because even if Arsenal have an amazing fixture, who's going to be the one getting the goals? You don't know. They need a lot of goals in order to get the FPL points, and even then, you're not necessarily going to get the bonus points because the attacking returns are spread. And that doesn't happen with talismanic players. They get all the bonus, they get all the goal involvements, and they're very safe and sensible players to pick. So I wanted to mention talismanic players because it's just not spoken about. People don't really talk about this. So those are my top secret FPL tips that the experts don't tell you about for whatever reason. Maybe this video was way too complicated and way too boring for most people. If so, I apologize, but I just wanted to try and put something a little bit different out there. So if you did enjoy it, please do make sure you drop a like and do subscribe if you're new around here as well. Like I said, really do recommend the Fantasy Football Hub Opta-Stats tool. I'll leave a link at the top of the description for you to go and check that out for yourself. And let me know what you think. I think it's just so useful if you're like a super FPL nerd like myself and you could just play with the data. It's absolutely excellent. But aside from that, guys, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you later, mates. Bye-bye.